Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don leading out today, but I'm joined by an interesting cast of folks. They'll all sound familiar to you. Some of them are new. Some of them have been around for, Chris, you've been around for a long time now on the podcast. You're almost an old timer now. I was looking back at the episode numbers of when you first came around, and they were double digits, and we're solidly into 33 into or 34 into triple digits now. So Chris, you're not new.
No. The scary thing is we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary. We recorded the first episode the week the world shut down.
Yeah, we were talking about that. I don't know if that was off podcast or on podcast. We were talking about that. But in addition to Chris Coppola, who you heard there, also have a couple of Erics here. One of the Erics goes back a little bit further. That's Eric Rush. Eric, how you doing this evening?
Doing great, Don. Good to be here.
And the newest member of our Fork in Time, and I think he'll probably obviously show up probably on the rim where it happened at some point too, because that just tends to happen in these little podcasts that are connected to each other, and that's Eric Bond. So Eric, good to have you here joining us with this group for the first time as well. So happy to have you once again with us.
Good to be here.
Good deal. We're going to roll straight into this. I've been thinking about this topic probably from when we first launched the podcast. And part of it because it ties to some other things that I do and that are part of other responsibilities that I carry in my life. One of those is teaching a Bible study in my local church. And we were launching off at about the time that the podcast was kicking off on a study that I was leading out that was historical in the church realm. And so this event kept coming back to me as something that would make an interesting fork in history. And so the event we're going to talk about today is what if Constantine, that would be the Roman Emperor Constantine, had not converted to Christianity. And so our fork today is going to be a non-conversion for Constantine. So let me take care of a little bit of the housekeeping before we engage and have everybody here throw a little bit into the historical what did. I recognize that a lot of historians question whether or not this conversion was a quote unquote true conversion. Did he convert for political reasons? Did he convert for reasons of conviction? That we would call them religious reasons, or was it just a happy coincidence that it was both? Regardless of where you fall on that, I think it doesn't matter for the topic in general, because whether his conversion was genuine as a personal conversion or not, it happened. And so it had its influence, whether it was, a true conversion at the time, whether it was a true conversion later. I think we will probably talk about a little bit of how things spun out over his life. He had a conversion, but then he had a deathbed baptism. So the question is, at what point did he really convert? But there's no doubt that his conversion meant the conversion of how Christianity stood inside the Roman Empire. That's where the historical import comes in. There's no doubt that is significant. But I think we can talk a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about, looking for the sincerity of that conversion. But I think it doesn't really matter for the historical fork, except that it's just an interesting thing that's there. Although you might argue, now that I've said all of that part of how you set the fork up, and we've decided the fork's going to be as if there was not at the famous battle. I'm trying to remember if that's 1311 or 1313. I've just suddenly lost my train of thought on that, but
the battle was 1312, if I remember, Don.
1312, yeah, and we'll talk about that in particular here. But what we remember about the battle is the story that it's told is that Constantine saw a vision in the sky. Now, what exactly he saw seems to be some type of light, and seems to have an element of a cross or perhaps an ichthus type of symbol that he saw. The ichthus being the shape of the fish that is so associated. The cross and the fish are the two symbols of Christianity that are pretty consistent throughout most of its history. and that he saw one of those two symbols, and he, depending on which account you read, heard a voice or saw the words, but basically it's under this sign conquer. So he's getting ready to go into battle. And what's of import here is that he sees what is clearly identified in his mind as a Christian symbol, and that this symbol is going to bring him victory if he takes this on as the reason that he's going to be successful. And then as a result of, if he is successful, that he will honor that. Did I do that a fair job, guys? Is there anything more any of you would like to add to sort of that just quick summary of what sets up Constantine's conversion?
The only thing I would add is that the specific symbol is a Chi-Rho, which is the first two letters in Greek
Right.
of Christ.
And so what you see there's like a P and an X, and it's
Yeah.
again often associated with the P has a cross element to it in some elements, and then the X element has the element of the fish thing. That's why those two things connect together. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
But you're right, the Chi-Rho.
Yeah, if nobody knew Greek, they would probably just see it and it's like, okay, no keys allowed.
Yeah.
It looks like a key with a giant X through it, and it's like no keys. Everything is unlocked here.
Yeah. So I think it is important in terms of setting up the what did here, and we don't want to spend too much time on the what did. This is not the Rome of Augustus Caesar. This is not the Rome of first century Rome. This is not even the Rome of Marcus Aurelius. This is the Rome that is several hundred years removed from what you might call its zenith in terms of absolute power. Maybe not in terms of territory controlled, but in terms of absolute power. And it's also not the Rome of a clear-cut single ruler, which is part of the reason this whole thing is going on. This is not him going and conquering some, as they would call them, barbarian people in the sense of under this sign. It's actually in the middle of what essentially amounts to a Roman civil war, as I remember and understand the story. Do I have that right, guys?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And quite a messy one at that.
Yeah. And part of it was because before that, there had been, I'm trying to remember now which emperor it was. I don't have that direct set of notes in front of me. The empire had been divided into two halves or four halves, or four parts, depending on how you want to describe it. There were sort of two co-emperors, and then there were two elements inside of each half of the empire that controlled or maintained direction over those two halves. Diocletian was the one who had split the empire in the early 290s, I think around 292, 293, if my memory is serving correctly. And now I have my notes in front of me, so I'll be not relying upon my memory, which is a much better place to be.
And that's exactly right, Don. And they were two co-emperors, but they weren't co-equal emperors. One was an Augustus, and then one was a Caesar in either side, and the Caesars were subordinate to the Augustus.
Yeah. So Rome had been around long enough now to need an org chart. Not that it didn't have one before, sort of from the Republic days and the ways that worked, but even inside of Imperial Rome now, there was something of an org chart. And so this is actually the two. Constantine eventually reunites Diocletian's division. That's the key thing that comes out of this. And so this civil war that is going on is about that and how that's going to come to be. What else do you think we ought to cover on the historical what did, guys?
I think it would be important to note that, so during this time of it's roughly called four emperors, it's the Tetrarchy, essentially. This is the time period in which we see Christianity and other monotheistic groups be under heavy persecution from Diocletian and his co-Augustus Galerius, and they essentially decided, for the sake of the empire, we need to crack down on Christians, we need to crack down on any group that does not strictly go with our brand of emperor polytheism, because there's the cult of the emperor, which is connected to the gods, and they had started kind of taking up a specific worship of one god, Sol Invictus. And so these other groups, which either would denounce things like pouring libations out to images of the emperor, calling the gods false idols during city festivals and worship were seen as ultimately a destabilizing factor. The problem is that after Diocletian had done this, not all of the emperors agreed or thought it was a good plan. Constantine's father, who is the Caesar, so a junior partner to the province of Britain and Gaul, kind of only selectively enforced the rules. He had more of a lighter hand to where he's like, okay, I'll take some property from some Christians. That's not a big deal to me, but I won't kill them. That seems excessive and would be difficult to enforce.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, Eric, because there are multiple periods of extreme persecution of Christians that exist, literally from the founding of the religion in the first century on. But it's not consistent. It's not like there's 300 consistent years of the exact same type of persecution. It's very much about the personalities of the emperors, or those, and the motivations, as you said, of, we don't like the fact that they're gathering property. We don't like the fact that they're in a position of authority here. And the empire was a big place. And so even when there was an emperor who was opposed, and the type that was not only permissive of, but in some cases encouraging persecution, that doesn't mean that it also happened empire-wide, because it was somebody locally had to be willing to do that. And in many cases, the relationships that existed in local areas far from Rome were either far friendlier to Christians or were the opposite at other times. So again, this idea of consistent, yes, it's one empire, but there's not consistency in terms of how this plays out. And to your point, there's not even consistency on religious worship throughout most of the empire. There's a variety that's going on there. Some of it being the inherited Greek, now become Roman gods. Some of it being, the Sol Invictus scenario that really is closer to what we're talking about here. There's other, there's warrior cults like Mithras. There's elements of Zoroastrianism that have crept into the eastern side of the empire. There still is now dispersed. There are Jews that are now dispersed throughout the empire because of the diaspora after 70 AD and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And so there is diversity of religion throughout the empire. And it's actually, I think that's one of the most interesting things about that we'll talk about in this fork, is how there was diversity and then there sort of wasn't. There now was going to be a more official state religion that was different than the state religion that existed before, and that Christianity, being a non-recognized and in some cases persecuted religion, becomes the official religion of the state.
That's one thing I'd talk to, is a lot of these other religions were very accepted and were kind of conglomerated onto what amounted to the Roman religion. One of the big problems with first Judaism and then Christianity was the first commandment, that I am the Lord thy God and you shall have no other God other than me. When all of these other groups are coming to contact with the Roman Empire, fine, we'll make your gods gods too. We'll just include them in the pantheon. But the core tenet of those two monotheistic religions said that that is unacceptable. So that set up a lot of the conflict, where some of the other minority religions were perfectly accepted and flourished under the empire.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great point, Chris. The other thing I just want to mention about that is that, again, talking about this idea of how much tolerance versus non-tolerance existed, which ebbed and flowed throughout the history of the empire. There was a time, for example, before the rise of Christianity with Judaism, that as long as they pay their taxes, in fact, this is the setting of the New Testament in terms of where Judaism was with respect to Rome. The Sanhedrin exists. It's a fairly autonomous body as long as they don't step out of line, as long as, barring again from scripture, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God, and everything is okay. As long as Caesar gets his taxes, he's good with this. But there was definitely more of a disparity between these two monotheistic faiths, particularly Christianity, which had arisen to be the more prominent of the two, and the all-inclusive. Sure, we can add that. We can add that. That's just another thing on the buffet. We'll just add one more thing to the buffet. And I will just plug here for those of you that are familiar with Bernard Cornwell, who's a great historical fiction writer. I first became exposed to the idea of Mithras in one of the best audiobooks, by the way, I've ever heard, and a strong book called The Winter King. If you like the Arthurian story, this is just a plug. I couldn't say Mithras and not throw this in. I tremendously recommend The Winter King and the books that follow that. It's one of the best tellings of the Arthur legend with sort of a little bit more of a basis in history, but still picking up a lot of the legend stuff that's there. So that's a free plug. I recommend it as an audiobook. It's one of the best audiobooks that I've ever listened to. So The Winter King is a good thing there. But I mentioned it because of Mithras being heavily involved in the plot of that. And it was the case of the Christians who maybe were adopting some of the Mithrathic practice if they were warriors and back and forth. There's even some who will say that Christianity borrowed or stole or incorporated elements of Mithras into what became early Christianity. We're not going to go down those paths today, except for me to acknowledge that if you're a listener and you're familiar with that, we are familiar with that too. But that's not where we're going to be focusing in here today, except as how it touches to this. So again, the sign that he sees is at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which is basically right there at Rome. This is where this contest is happening. And he sees this sign, and basically it's under this sign, conquer. And again, that sign being the Chi-Rho, recognized as a Christian symbol. Anything else about the setup there, guys?
The only thing else I would add is Rome's basic conception towards religion was that when they would conquer an area, they would essentially say, your pantheon, we're going to add their names to our gods' names, and it's going to be like an epitaph. So that's how they kind of understood the world. So when they met people who believed in the Norse religions, they were confused because it's like, why is Mercury the leader of these gods? I know they call him Odin, but it's just weird. With Judaism, they gave an exception because it was like, well, it's an ancient religion that's older than our state, so we'll give them a free pass. Like you said, pay the taxes, don't cause trouble, we'll be fine. Christianity also comes up into trouble because, well, the Romans killed the guy.
Right.
And executed him for subversive activities. So it's just this very weird religion of like, why are they worshiping a criminal?
Well, and not only that, but even in the first century, and you'll see scholars even talk about this today, is was Christianity just another sect of Judaism in its very early days? You even see this in the Christian New Testament, where there's questions about, do you have to first become a Jew before you can become a Christian, for example? And so I think even in the case of Rome, there for the first, I don't know, few decades, they were even confused about what it was. Is this another sect of Judaism? Because there were multiple sects of Judaism that existed in the first century, and even after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But yeah, you make excellent points there, Eric. And this is, and Chris made them as well. What is different about this, which is also why it was persecuted at various places, and also because, like a lot of movements, be they political or be they religious, they thrive sometimes under persecution. And so what had happened here, early Christianity was not extinguished by the persecutions that were brought against it. It was sustained in many cases by what was there, which becomes an important consideration, I think, in terms of how it moves forward over time.
Well, I think, and we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but I think it's important for the setup to say that with this in mind, with Christianity still flourishing in spite of the fact that it is at least regionally persecuted, it is still a religion on the upswing.
Yes,
it is becoming an increasingly popular religion, and that plays into probably Constantine's decision here. And I'm tipping my hand a little bit into what I think about Constantine as in terms of his decision making. But I think it's important to note that Christianity was very much on the upswing in the empire at the time.
So in the excellent point, Eric. And so in picking up again, just closing out the what did here. So again, the what did could go on forever, because the what did goes down all the way to today. So, where to stop it is the tough part. But that certainly what did happen with Constantine's conversion is that persecution, well, by the way, persecution still existed against Christians. It didn't just automatically stop, but it was not state-sponsored persecution. And in many cases, the state was now protecting churches and leadership that existed in various parts inside of the empire, which was an important thing that was there. Constantine's going to relocate the capital. That's one of the things that he's most known for. Rome becomes Constantinople, and as a result, we have the eastern part of the Western Empire, the Byzantine Empire, that lasts for a really long time after the German quote unquote barbarians. Anybody who's not Roman is a barbarian. That's their definition of the term. Goes on from there. But Constantine then also formally endorses or allows meetings to take place. Probably the most noticeable of those is one of the first great ecumenical councils, of which they're normally recognized to be 7, and that's the Council of Nicaea. And the Council of Nicaea is not just a gathering of all of the leaders, normally referred to as bishops throughout most of the empire, who are the leaders in particular cities or areas, prominent cities inside of that. Alexandria, for example, and Egypt being one of them, Antioch in Syria being another one. But these, the bishops and the other leaders who had gathered together before, and they had had councils and they had had discussions. This one was different in that Constantine organized it. He brought it together. It was under his protection, under his authority, and he is there for the whole council. So or most of the council. So if there's any question about whether this is a legal gathering of Christian leadership to gather to discuss what were inside of the church and are still considered to be by theologians important questions that needed to get decided, heresies that needed to get confronted, and things that needed to be sorted out, it wasn't just the religious leaders. Oh, by the way, there's the emperor sitting over there who's obviously giving his assent to this. And one of the other things I remember the first time, one of the things that Constantine does is pays for the preparation and distribution of a large number of Bibles. And that's a big deal. There's no Gutenberg yet. So there's no printing press. So producing these Bibles is a very expensive and time-consuming endeavor. It's nice to have the emperor's purse that's going to do that for you to make sure that it's going to happen. And so in the real timeline, the Council of Nicaea, and eventually Christianity becomes essentially the recognized formal religion of the state. Constantine is baptized on his deathbed. His mother goes on all types of journeys and pilgrimage. She's identifying holy sites all over the Holy Land, left and right. Many of the sites that are revered today, she believes were revealed to her. I should also say that it's not like once this happens, it's set in stone that Rome is forever Christian, because there are periods of time when there are emperors that come into power that reverse this, and it goes back and forth. But generally speaking, from this point forward, Christianity holds. There are periods when there's pushback, but generally from this point on, the Roman Empire religiously is Christian. Anything else about the what did that you think are the huge points we need to hit there before we go down the what didn't and the what if, guys?
I think that's a good setup, Don.
All right. So we decided that our fork was going to be that he does not convert and that he does not adopt. And so the way we decided, the simplest way to do that is he doesn't see this vision. So I want Eric B here to briefly mention, this is not the first time we've got Constantine seeing stuff, right?
That is correct. So 2 years, so this would be about 310. He had gone to see an Apollonian oracle. So these are specially set for the god Apollo, and he claims that he saw Apollo there. Apollo and him hung out. Apollo said, "You're great. You're going to rule for a long time. You're going to conquer the known world. It's going to be awesome." And he said, "That sounds awesome. Okay, I'm part of Apollo." Apollo was generally seen as connected to Sol Invictus. They share a lot of the same qualities, mostly sun-related imagery. Not that sun with a U. It gets confusing. And we can go into that later. But at this point, he starts making coins that connect him with Sol Invictus and with the god Apollo. So this is seen as what his base level faith is, what he professes himself to be. And this is also a connection to Diocletian and Aurelian before him, who were also adherents to Sol Invictus.
Which is basically, it's a form of sun worship. And there's been lots of variants of that throughout history. You know, the Egyptians certainly had that, others as well. But you're right, the SON versus SUN is a fun little thing here that sort of makes that play out. And so this is not the first time that he has invoked religion in what he's doing. I think that's a fair thing to say here. So if he doesn't say that this is the result of Christianity, one of the possible forks is maybe he attributes this to it's Sol Invictus, right? That's what gave me the victory here, right?
Right. He could still say that he is a strict follower of Sol Invictus. Now, that's kind of loose about what that exactly means. We don't have a ton of records of what that specific practice was, because it was kind of henotheistic, where it was, there are other gods, I just choose personally to exalt one god, which is Sol Invictus. So kind of think of Aten under Akhenaten. He doesn't say there aren't any other gods. He just really likes this weird sun disk with arms.
Right. And that is the predominant god. I'm not saying there aren't other gods, but this is the predominant, top god. And there were elements of the Greek pantheon that had this, yes, but Zeus keeps them in line, right?
Exactly.
That kind of thing that's there. So if we don't see Christianity become sanctioned here because of Constantine not saying I conquered under this, we talked about sort of breaking this up. And by the way, this is going to be a 2-part episode. I want to mention that now. So we will reach a stopping point here, and then don't be surprised when we say we're coming back, because we think it's too big of a topic just to try to contain to one episode or turn it into the marathon that it would be if we tried to do that, which we're prone to do, and we know that about ourselves. But if Christianity doesn't rise at this point under Constantine, I guess my first question is, for the short-term difference here, what's different? What goes down that fork? How is that fork different than what actually happened in the real what did?
I think we would see probably a more frustrated Constantine. Constantine was a very frustrated person throughout most of his reign, especially when he starts involving himself in church politics. I think because he had so many Christians in his armies, he would still be predisposed to legalizing Christianity and other monotheistic religions because, well, they fought for me, they're here, and it's just too much of a hassle to try and persecute them now, especially when because he still has a co-emperor at this time. He has Licentius, I believe is his name, who is also very keyed in on protecting Christians and maybe start favoring them. So that would be a very interesting divide, especially before they have their own civil war, in which Constantine then becomes the primary emperor. So there's still a 2-emperor setup with East and West before Constantine takes the prize. But during that time, they allow Christianity and other monotheistic religions, like I mentioned, to flourish. One of the key competitors, which had recently arisen, was Manichaeism, which is a newer faith which has a lot of universalist syncretic. By that I mean it kind of adapts all religions into it. It's not tied to one ethnic group, and it usually will combine. So the primary ones was Buddhism and Christianity, and they have their own prophet Mani, who was, according to their codexes, crucified within the Persian Empire.
Right. So one of the other forks could be there that he adopts Manichaeism as in lieu of Christianity. There were other contenders that he may have chosen instead of Christianity. We mentioned the Sol Invictus. We mentioned Manichaeism. We gave a little reference there to Mithras, which was primarily a soldier cult. It was a very, very militaristic favored thing that's there. But
Or Glycon the Python. Don't forget.
Yeah.
Glycon the Python, he's great. He has a friend named Alex. They're Greeks. And they said there's a whole creed against Glycon the Python because they accused him of being a puppet. That it's like, that's not a real snake. It's a puppet snake that he's believing he can talk to. And that's great. And I want more of that in our lives.
Yeah, there's it's interesting to read these because again, we're so encapsulated by our modern understandings of so much of religion here, and even how in diversity of religion, how we think about them. And you know, there was more diversity even then than we can imagine existed there.
Yeah, and I think that would persist. I think that would be my thought, is that there, you know, you could certainly have a later adoption of Manichaeism by Constantine. I think that's absolutely possible. But I think it's also possible that he may just stay with Sol Invictus. It's been working for him so far. It's working for a lot of his forebears. And so even though the population may be switching to different religions, may go for something syncretic like Manichaeism, or maybe just be a lot of various religions. There may be pockets of Christianity, Judaism, you know, traditional Roman god worship, and others. So I think you may have a very heterogeneous empire, which I think has really interesting implications, presuming that the Western Empire still falls as it does, you know, some 100 years later, as it does in our timeline. That would be very interesting if you didn't have that unification of the church for most of the former Western Roman Empire.
Right.
And I know
and as a result, didn't have the transplanted church further east in the same way to fill that void, you know, to a degree when there was the fall of the West.
Right.
You know, the political West fell. Rome as a center of Western Christianity didn't. That was what happened with, you know, pick your year. 476 is the one that I tend to center, you know, figuring out which one of those sackings of Rome you really want to call the end of the Western Empire. But a big thing that's there. One of the things I wanted to chase just really quickly, and I want to be careful not to pull this too far down the theological bend, but there was a reason that the Council of Nicaea was called. There were lots of reasons why the Council of Nicaea was called, but one of the major reasons that was called was that there was a rising, growing schism in Christianity on a particular theological, philosophical topic, and that was what came to be known as Arianism. And boy, you could really go deep here, so I'm not going to try to go deep into what this is, but basically what the first thing that is trying to be sort of determined at that council, it plays out over most of the ecumenical councils moving forward from there, is the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, and who is Jesus versus God. Jesus is God, but he's also not. So they're trying to figure out what this is, and Arianism is one of the ways that this is brought forward. And this actually, there are two big leaders sort of in this that are both early church fathers and early church writers. You probably have heard their names before. One of them is Eusebius, who is a strong advocate of what's going on. In fact, he's been there's exiling that's going on inside of the church because of these competing beliefs. And then there's Athanasius, who is on the other side, to some degree on the other side of this argument. And this is the main thing that they debate at the Council of Nicaea. That's why you come out of there with a creed, is they want to actually put into words what they believe and what they don't believe, because it hadn't been formalized in that sense. And so again, I don't want to chase that down, except to say that one of the things that does happen in the real timeline, because Constantine calls this council, sponsors this council, facilitates this council, is this growing schism inside of Christianity is addressed. It's not solved, by the way, at the Council of Nicaea. It takes more councils and it takes more time over time for that to happen. But eventually what does come out of the backside of the series of ecumenical councils that run through to about 500 AD is a fairly homogeneous view of Christianity. And my argument would be one of the things that happens because Constantine converts is there's a mechanism that sort of gets put into motion. It takes a couple of centuries to play it out, but you do come out with a fairly consistent, quote unquote, orthodox view, agreed view of Christianity. And Christianity, particularly around the Mediterranean in the Roman Empire, is fairly homogeneous. It has diversity to it. Without Constantine being the engine that starts that, I envision the fork being a very heterogeneous way that Christianity would continue to develop. And so, to Eric's point, to Eric Rush's point, is that if the Western Empire still falls, the Christianity that's there is not the Christianity that grew out of what Constantine started, but it's still diverse and it's still very different. And now there's no central political authority to sort of make it be any more homogeneous. And I think you get a very different look and feel of what we know today as Christianity.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you used an interesting word, Don, that is very different from the word I learned when I was in catechism and learning about the First Council of Nicaea. You used the word Orthodox. I did not learn that word. I learned the word Catholic. So the First Council of Nicaea was also the first ecumenical council of the Catholic Church.
Catholic meaning universal.
Catholic meaning universal. Right. But eventually also came to apply to the Roman Church.
Right. And then I use that term. I actually come from a Protestant tradition, so fair disclosure here. But I'm very familiar with the Catholic tradition as well that it flows from.
Right.
Is that Catholic is a very intentionally chosen word there to mean universal, which also means that it is the orthodox. It is the correct way that everyone should be doing in terms of looking at things theologically. And if you really study that period of Christian history, there was a diversity of thought. There continues to be a diversity of thought, but particularly over that 200 to 300 year span, a lot of things that we look at today as Christians or those outside of the faith who look at it and see how it's come to be as they come to study it, those are the idea, who is the Trinity? Who is God? Who is Christ? What is this third part of the Trinity called the Holy Spirit? Wait a second, you're monotheist, but that sounds like three gods, but it's three in one. Figuring all of that part out is what happens. There comes to be a fairly uniform, that'd be another word you might use in addition to orthodoxy, a uniform understanding of that most of us know that grew up in that tradition or have studied that tradition pretty well. By the way, that's not the case in Northern Europe, where you see a lot more influence of Arian thought that was sort of pushed out of the Roman Church, or some of the things that actually come to be in Eastern Europe, and even later with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which comes to bring some of the concepts that were set aside back into it. Again, I think the fork is Christianity would be in its earlier time frame, being picking up from the 4th century on, would be more diverse and would stay more diverse versus becoming more uniform and then later having more diversity, if that makes any sense.
Well, and even to the point, would we recognize what we consider modern Christianity? Would we recognize them as all being of the same religion?
Perhaps not.
Because I think we could say, Protestantism, Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, they're all still recognizably Christianity, even though there's some differences. But I think with something like this that doesn't universalize, doesn't have that, that orthodoxy, as you put it, Don, I think you might end up with something that was incredibly different. Because if you read about Arianism, it's quite different. I mean, it's quite different.
Right. And, one of the big issues is the homostasis or homoousian concept of, what does it mean to be the same yet different? Jesus is the same. He's the same as God, yet obviously he's different than God, or else, is this a different personality? I mean, literally, the best minds in the world are challenging for a couple of hundred years, are trying to even find the right language to define this in a way. They struggle with the language here, and in some cases have to invent language for it.
Right.
And I definitely do think that there, in my study of this, and I've spent a little more time, I think, than the average person has in this. I think we see a much more heterogeneous flavors of Christianity that are earlier. They persist for longer. They will then go down their separate paths that may make them look very different by the time they go through several centuries of development or millennium of development. To your point, yes, they seem to have a common source, but they're very different by the time you get to, maybe what we think of as being the Middle Ages. And then we're not even getting into there, which is the other part of this, the elements of Christianity that appear to have influenced and been adopted into Islam as well, which is a whole other, thing that's going on here. What element of Christianity would have had an influence on Islam or vice versa is a big part of that. What else in the near term for the fork?
Well, doing just a quick search to get everything set up. Here are some of the big things that Constantine will have to deal with. He has to have a civil war with Licinius, who is his co-emperor, who he defeats in the year 324 before becoming the sole ruler of the empire. He will have to also deal with, it's according to some sources, but it's not seen as established why he did this, but he orders the execution of his primary heir, Crispus, who has the most military experience. He's the oldest. He's an adult by the Roman standard, because apparently he had an affair with the second wife of Constantine, who is Fausta, who he also later has killed. And this actually starts a whole split between him and the Neoplatonists, which are philosophers who have taken up the traditions of Plato and Socrates and going into that thought, which was also seen as their own kind of weird crossing between religion and philosophy. And because the Neoplatonists said, no, we're not going to give you any forgiveness for doing that, that also kind of pushed Constantine reportedly towards the direction of Christianity. And then him establishing Constantinople in Byzantium, which eventually will become Istanbul.
Yeah. And he has to deal with all of that separate from what he did in the real timeline, which is unifying under at least a single religious banner or adopted thing there. In fact, I think it's interesting that he unites, as you mentioned there in 324, it's in 325 that he has the Council of Nicaea. It's only after things are united under him that he's able to have that in the real timeline, that ecumenical council, that first one. That was unifying the empire was a prerequisite to being able to do that. Versus the other way around, which is that you might think, well, his choice was the thing that it was to some degree what allowed the unification, but the political military unification happens first before you're really able to explore the other thing that happens there. It's not because of his choice to adopt Christianity.
Yeah, and in 316, so 9 years before the Council of Nicaea, so anyone who's keeping notes by hand, I'm sorry, but this is just how my brain works. So the first time Constantine even goes into church politics is over the Donut Schism, which is all about should priests who during the persecutions turned over religious materials, books, what have you, over to the authorities and who renounced the faith, should they be allowed to practice the faith again? A priest named Donatist, shocking, I know, it's the Donut Schism. He argues, no, we shouldn't allow them back into the church. He starts basically a brawl in North Africa over it. And Constantine offered, after Donatus writes him and says, can you please intercede on our behalf? I just feel like we're not getting a fair shake from the church. And Constantine said, sure, we'll convene a meeting here and we'll hear you out. So this is the first time he is acting on behalf of the church into church politics. He makes the argument that, well, as the Pontificus Maximus, so this would be the head of the state church of the Roman Empire, this is his right to intervene. And church officials are either very excited because it means, hey, maybe he's becoming a Christian, or are very skeptical because of, hey, I don't remember us electing you to anything, and you don't seem to be a bishop. Also, aren't you a pagan?
Yeah, it's that question of again, this goes back into that idea of where the authority would lie, and then ultimately what happens is there's a mixture of the political and the religious authority together as time moves forward. And as the other Eric already mentioned, there, eventually the church becomes centered in Rome. The church becomes centered in Rome even after and continues to be centered in Rome, even after the political authority has been moved from Rome to further east to Constantinople. Chris, you're awful quiet. Jump in here for us.
I've got something I'm going to bring up in the big picture.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So we're going to hold for that for part
Yeah.
two.
Yes.
Okay.
Trust me. This is a really interesting idea, but it's pretty far removed from where we are right now.
Okay.
Okay.
So again, I mentioned that we would sort of be taking this in two parts, and we're probably getting to the end of the first part as we're talking about the short path here. So I'm going to sort of go around and just ask if we have agreement here. We still think that whether Constantine conquers under the sign or just conquers, he's successful, right? That
Yes.
eventually he does restore the empire back under a single unified rule, moving away from the Tetrarchy then to the sort of the dual concept that's there. Does he still move the empire's capital further east for the reasons that he does? So we still end up with Constantinople, we believe.
I think so. I mean, I think the reasons for creation of Constantinople to me were more far-ranging economic and political reasons than the conversion. So I think he still does that. And
Okay.
now, does it look a little different?
Perhaps.
With the way it's constructed, with the less, at least unofficial Christian influence? Maybe it does for the time.
Okay. And it was suggested, I think, by more than one of the folks here that he probably is fairly lenient was the word that popped up. Fairly tolerant. That's the word I'm really looking for. Tolerant. So you probably would have had at least tolerance of Christianity, even if he's not conquering, officially naming it the state religion, tolerant of it. So in that sense, there is the ability for Christianity to continue to thrive and flourish, perhaps with less of the persecution element. As I've suggested here, I think it may be different flavors of Christianity that are now side by side competing. There might have ultimately been a council, just not under the emperor's behest, to try to resolve these things. And as I think Eric Bond pointed out there, they really didn't sort of resolve the things fully there. They came out with something, but those who were not happy left. And there was still division, and they had to come back time and time again to get this resolved. In fact, what we know is the Nicene Creed is actually the Nicene Constantinople Creed. They have to come back and sort of rewrite it and sort of tweak it, several decades later, because there's continuing evolving of the concepts and the questions that are at hand. Nothing is settled there. So in the short term, is it a fair summary to say, yeah, it's a little bit different because there's no Constantine championing Christianity, but a lot of what we know of Constantine probably still happens anyway?
I think as long as the Christians of this time period, don't throw themselves behind Licentius, his co-emperor before the Civil War, I think probably still stays tolerant of the Christians, probably annoyed because of all of the riots breaking out between the Arians and the strict Trinitarians. But I think he would largely be more live and let live of, as long as you're not causing trouble, I don't have a strong issue. I think he might be more, to use a more modern phrase, he's more of a nationalist, to where he sees himself as, we need to combine under one strict rule. And that was ultimately his appeal with Sol Invictus: one ruler, one God, one empire.
Okay. So it sounds like the short fork runs parallel to the primary history that we know it. But if you tune in for the next episode, I have a feeling we're going to divide the roads a little bit more as we move forward over time. So unless anybody has anything they want to close out here on this particular episode, we'll set up our return for next week's episode where we continue down this path. Anybody have any last thoughts here on the near term? All right.
Apparently, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say, I didn't know that Constantine was apparently Constantine the Great. This was shocking to find out in my research of like, is this a newer thing? Did we just start calling him the Great? I've never heard him referred to as the Great before.
I think that gets thrown around pretty loosely in history, unless it's Alexander. We've talked about him here recently on some things as well, but I think it gets thrown around a little bit more probably than maybe it should. The list of the real greats is probably pretty short. So once again,
find it interesting. I think there's kind of a natural point at which once there's more than 3 of something, you need to define one of them as the great.
Yeah, that may be true. And if for no other reason than to distinguish the ones that are there. I'm thinking actually of Roman history. Pliny, Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. You had to figure out which one was with, because they both called themselves the same name.
Only 2 of them. You didn't reach that third.
You didn't reach the 3.
mass.
So there needed to be one more Pliny before we found out who Pliny the Great was, I guess, at that point.
Or for Americans, if we get one more George Bush.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out how to distinguish those.
Same thing with Cato. Cato the Elder, Cato the Younger. He needed a 3rd.
Yeah, Cluso's butler. That's the good.
Well, and I think I'm thinking about this not in terms of Roman empires, but Carolingian Frankish kings and early French kings always had some sort of modifier, and often it wasn't very flattering.
Yeah.
The short, the bald, the stammerer. They weren't. One was called the sluggard. These were not really very flattering names in many cases, and so I think I would take the Great.
but the one that we know probably most, being Charlemagne, is
Charles the Great.
Charles the Great. Yeah. So so it holds there. All right, we're going to invite our listeners to join us back for next week's episode. So between now and then, I invite you to visit the website at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. And we hope you join our panel here as we come back for part 2 of What If Constantine Had Not Converted. And we'll talk to you then.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.